Behind me there, you can see the death trap. And below me is the Plain of Five Glaciers, because Canada is run by white people and white people are awful at naming things. No big transition here. We're just going to talk about nuclear war and the Ukraine conflict. I've always been of the belief that nukes were not likely to be used in this conflict, despite the rhetoric that has been coming out of the Kremlin ever since the war started back in February. Nukes don't achieve what the Russians want. Now, the Russian goal here is to capture all of Ukraine and then push through it in order to secure the access points to the Russian space, specifically the ones in Romania and Poland. So using tactical nukes on the battlefield in Ukraine doesn't help, because they then have to occupy that space, and that gets messy, and your soldiers get messy very, very quickly. Also, a strategic strike on the United States wouldn't help because, well, there's a lot of things we don't know about the Russian military, but we know its quality is lower than the American one, and that probably includes the nuclear arsenal. So even a single or limited strike on the United States would generate the end of the Russian system, and specifically the end of the entire Russian elite, Moscow, and personally Vladimir Putin. So that's never really been on the table either. That just leaves the question of using strategic nukes, city flatteners, in order to prevent Europeans from assisting the Ukrainians in the defense of their own country. And in that, that's always where the risk has been, in my opinion. So the Russians would go after the countries who, if they switched sides, either because they fell apart or because they were intimidated after losing a couple of cities, that would change the strategic balance in terms of weapon flows. And so that would be in order: Berlin, Warsaw, Stockholm, Paris, and then London. Now, in the days before September 1st, that is generally my position, that if the Russians feel that they have to nuke someone, those are the 5 cities they would go after, because it would disrupt the weapon flows going into Ukraine. However, in the aftermath of the Kharkiv offensive, the Ukrainians have captured sufficient equipment and tanks and artillery to equip 15,000 people in an entire armored division. That's a bigger weapon transfer to the Ukrainians than everything that NATO has done to this point. And in the Kherson offensive, which is still ongoing, they're likely to get even more gear. So weapon flows all of a sudden are not the important thing that they used to be. It's not that they're unimportant, but the Ukrainians are going to be able to put 30,000 additional troops into the field here with the best equipment that the Russians have. And unlike the Western gear where the Ukrainians need training, they already know how to use all the Russian gear. So we are at a tipping point. And that raises the question of whether nukes are of any use to the Russians whatsoever. That just leaves one possible scenario: that the Russians realize they're going to lose, that Putin realizes that he's done, that he realizes he's going to be a villain to history, not just Western history, Russian history, and he just decides to go out with a bang. While we can never rule that out, I find it unlikely. When the Soviet system collapsed, the then KGB basically had a meeting where they discussed whether they should just release the nukes onto the world, not in terms of launch, but sharing, so that the United States would then have to spend the next century dealing with it. They ultimately decided that even though they had lost, and that was sad for them, that they didn't want to be the end of the human condition, and so they kept the nukes bottled up as best they could. Putin was part of the organization that made that decision. So I find it unlikely at this point that he would go a different direction. The risk, and something that I'm sure the folks at the Defense Department are now stressing about a little bit, is we have seen how poorly maintained every aspect of the Russian military is. And it's an open question whether the Russian nuclear arsenal works. So in the worst case scenario, what happens if Putin hits the big red button, and we know it because we've been reading his email and listening to his phone calls, and nothing happens? What do you do when someone tries to kill tens of millions of people and fails? Now that's an interesting political question. I don't have an answer for you. Okay, that's it for me for now. Until next time. Now, you may have heard that in Europe there's a debate raging about whether or not they should ban all Russian passport holders from coming for tourist purposes, or just make it more difficult. The argument really is over the degree of the restrictions, and the easy visa policies that they negotiated several years ago have already been suspended. But there are a number of countries, most notably Sweden, Finland, Poland, and the Baltics, that want to make it a more extreme ban that just prevents Russians from coming regularly at all. The template for this would be South Africa under apartheid. At that point, you had a country where 10 to 15% of the population basically imposed its will on everyone else. Ugly system. And as a result, the Europeans and some other countries prevented South African passports from being used easily in the rest of the world. And the point here wasn't necessarily to punish or force an immediate change. There was no way that an economic system as entrenched and beneficial to the minority, such as we had under apartheid, could be easily shifted just because of tourism. And that's not the goal here with Russia. Instead, it is to impress upon everyday Russians, just like they did with everyday white Afrikaners, that you are no longer part of the civilized world, and you will not be treated as such. And until such time as you start abiding by some really basic concepts when it comes to human dignity, you are not welcome in the advanced system. This is going to work both better and worse in Russia compared to South Africa. First, the worst. South Africa, under apartheid, was, if you were white, still democracy. There was still a political pluralism system, there were still votes, they still mattered. None of that is the case in Russia. Russia is a single-party state where even the, quote, opposition parties are actually just arms of the ruling government. So the opportunity for political dissent and pressure from change from below is very, very limited. But it might also work better, because the Russians who do travel, the ones that are going to be affected by this, are not your rank and file. South Africa had a much more robust middle class among the whites than Russia has. So the people who are now going to be losing access are the people who actually have access to money. And that means that opposition isn't from below to a degree, it's from above. Now, this doesn't spell political change. This potentially spells revolution. But one way or another, that is the future of the Russian Federation. The question is whether it's in the short term or not. Personally, I don't think so. But this is the sort of policy that will nudge things in that direction. Okay, that's it for me. Until next time.